My name is Bayless Fitterman. I am a senior policy analyst on the K-12 education team at the Center for American Progress, and thank you all for coming out here and for staying and listening to this conversation. We're glad to have you, and we're so excited that you're joining in on the conversation. So can you pull up the next question, please? All right, so we're going to take another poll question. Please be ready to answer. If you are just arriving, text Kalila Harr, Harr 100 to 22333. How important is it for local, state, and federal government to prioritize developing education policies with directly impacted people at the beginning of the policy-making process? And we'll give you guys a second to answer that. Okay. All right, so it looks like most of the room is saying over 90% extremely important, which I'm sure that we all agree with. So I am introducing our next panel. The panel focused on developing education policies with communities at the center. Our first panelist is Calissa Wing. She's currently a professional development specialist. She's a former elementary school assistant principal, and she was the 2017 Department of Defense Education Activity Teacher of the Year. So please welcome to the stage, Calissa Wing. Our next panelist is Mr. Davon Love. He is a Baltimore-based political organizer. He is co-founder and director of public policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Our next panelist is Ms. Zakia Ansari. She is currently advocacy director of the New York State Alliance for Quality Education. Please welcome Zakia to the stage. And last but not least, our next panelist is William Pugh. He is a student organizer and a current senior at Howard University. And our managing director, Ms. Kalila Harris, who you've been seeing all day, she is going to moderate this next panel. Thank you.
All right, how's everybody doing? Hanging in there with us? Yes, I know we have some students in the back there. Hey students, how you guys doing? All right, glad to have you in the room. I want to do a couple of things, make a couple of notes. The first is, if you were here for the previous panel and it seemed a little bit church-like and like you didn't need to applaud or give an amen or won't he do it or she said that. So let's practice what you might say if you hear something that really resonates with you. Isn't it true community needs to be involved in policy making at the front end? Yes. And what would you say to that? Yeah. Okay. And isn't it true that student voice is critical in education policy making?
Well.
And what would you say to that? Right? Okay. Come through with the goodness. Like, you can say those things, okay? Because we want to stay awake until Representative Presley joins us to give us closing remarks. And we think, so the votes are going long. She will definitely be here to give closing remarks, but Rep. Hayes is also sticking with us and trying to make her way over to give remarks as well. So we want to be energetic. And when they get here and they say things that are compelling, how are we going to respond to them? Oh, no, not like that. How are we going to respond to the good Congress people when they come to give closing remarks? Yes, yes. Better vote for her. Okay, you better, well, I'm not allowed to say that, but I may or may not agree with you. All righty, so let's go on into this amazing panel. we saw that everybody pretty much said it is either extremely important or important for communities to be involved in policymaking. CAP released a report recently in July called A Quality Education for Every Child, where we lay out a policy agenda around education policy. And at the core of that was that education policies needed to be developed with an explicit race equity lens, not conflating race with income, because we know students at any income level, yes, for following directions. Won't he do it? Okay. We know students at any income level, and when we control for income, there is still a $23 billion gap between predominantly white districts and predominantly non-white school districts. And so controlling for income, there are still deep disparities based on race. When we talk about an explicit race equity lens, we are meaning that if you're an Indian country, you do not create policies by throwing things around like, well, you know, black and brown kids. Which black and brown kids are you talking about, right? Are we talking about Native American children? And if you're in the North Pacific Northwest, you don't just throw around black and brown kids because you're not really saying, you know, the Hmong students in this community are really struggling. The Cambodian students in this community are really struggling. We need to do some specific planning that acknowledges and affirms their culture. Embedded in that and throughout all of our policy making is community-informed practice. And so CAP, we acknowledge that in the past we sometimes did policy making by saying we need to have a closed-door conversation with the experts. And the experts often did not include Williams and Kalisas and Zakiyas and Davons or any of our young people in the back room. And so policies were then being done to people as opposed to with people, and we no longer want to be a party to that form of policy making. In fact, we want to escalate people's urgency around involving communities on the front end to policy making. So with that said, I want to turn to the panel. I'd love for you all to just give 2 minutes about who you are, what brings you to the table, and why it was important for you to be involved in this discussion. And we'll start with our scholar here, William.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for, everyone hear me? Test.
There you go.
Oh. Hello?
Yes.
Thank you guys for having.
It's dropping out.
Thank you guys for having me. My name is William Pugh. I'm a senior at Howard University studying political science. And what got me involved in all of this, thank you for the clap.
Yeah. Howard University. Come on, see? You guys can do it.
HU? Couple of bison in the room. All right.
Morgan State. Yes. See?
So I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. Yes, Charleston. So kind of where I entered this whole conversation is I went to a very predominantly white high school. The name is Academic Magnet High School. I know, a very unoriginal, non-creative name for a high school. But it was just that. It was an academic magnet high school in North Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the most immediate things that anyone would notice walking into that space when I was there from 2012 to 2016 is that there were only 12 black students there in a school of 650, including me. And you know, entering that space and going throughout all those 4 years, it became increasingly apparent that there had to be something done. And the diversity problem at the school really manifested itself 5 years ago in October, when the football team took it upon themselves, after beating predominantly black football teams. You know, keep in mind, my school is extremely white, and my football team is extremely white. And after they beat black football teams, they started a post-game ritual of taking a watermelon, drawing a racial character on it, making monkey noises and smashing it after beating black teams. I can't even make that up. That's exactly what happened. And this came to light. It became a huge problem. The coach was fired by the superintendent, and then the parents and players organized and ended up getting the coach rehired and the superintendent fired for firing the coach, as backwards as that is. So anyway, long story short, a classmate of mine wrote an op-ed called "Sometimes a Watermelon is Just a Watermelon. Why is there a big problem?" I wrote one in response called "Sometimes a Watermelon Isn't Just a Watermelon." Became a huge problem at my school. And the next day, you know, people were, "I hate you. If you feel that way, why are you at our school?" And through all of that, I organized with other friends on campus, started a group called SAME, Students Advocating for Multicultural Education. And we advocated at the school board level, at the school level, and the community level, started partnering with other schools to really talk about diversity and specifically increasing Black diversity at predominantly white high schools in Charleston County.
What? Yes, you did that. Come on now, William. All right.
Okay, so how did I get started? Oh, so I'm a mom of 8 and I have 3 grandchildren. And when I started this work almost 20 years ago, I had no idea what organizing was. I didn't know what labor was. Just very basic, just minding my business, trying to raise 7 children. My husband and I were trying to raise them, not thinking about anything. And like many parents, my avenue into this work was through the Parent Teachers Association. Again, which I didn't want to join, but one of my kids' teachers was like, "You should join." I was like, "Okay, I'm going to try it," because I literally was getting lost in being a mother and a wife and didn't know who Zakiya was. The path was paved for me. I didn't know it then. I'm reflecting on it now, knowing that there was this moment that I didn't know was going to happen that got me here to be sitting on this stage today before you. And through that process of going to meetings and really learning, there was a parent collaborative that was being formulated. And so I started to get involved, learn a lot about what unions were and labor was, and actually realized that the great education that my children were getting was almost like, it was luck. Because they went to the school like everybody else. Neighborhood school was across the street, elementary school, they went there. The middle school was maybe 10-minute bus ride away, they went there, right? And fortunately, both schools that they went to were really great schools. And so through the process of learning and understanding and actually starting to organize is when I realized my rose-colored glasses were taken off, and I realized that every child didn't have access and opportunity like my children did. And actually, it was just literally luck that they did have great schools that they went to, and fortunately, I'm glad they did. And so it's been this kind of 20-year journey and path to better myself, to learn so much, and to help other parents and community members get to a space where they can be advocates themselves. And often I say, back in the day, if someone looked at me the way some people look at parents, they would have said I was an uninvolved parent, right? Because we define that as being at a meeting, showing up, parent-teacher conferences and all those other things, and not paying attention to the other parts of life that are happening, right? As just basically raising kids and everything that we experience. And so it was part of that process and journey that got me from being a parent volunteer, understanding, organizing, getting some victories and wins on citywide levels, et cetera, that got me to a space where now I'm employed by the organization that I was actually volunteering with, the Alliance for Quality Education. And so it's been like this, the ignorance, ignorance is bliss, I get it. And just want to lean in and just say, and be in a vulnerable moment, like, I'm gonna be real clear, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, emotionally, psychologically, and physically. This work is hard work, right? And I want to lean in and say that because sometimes we see people up here and we're like, oh, look what she did, oh, she did all this stuff. I literally today sit in this space telling you I'm exhausted and I'm tired. It won't stop me, but I think it's important to share that so people don't get this pie in the sky thinking that, oh, it's good, oh, you can do this, it's exhausting every single day. It's hard to get up and say I'm gonna do this and rewind and do it again.
Spread some love, Brother Love.
So again, my name is Davon Love. I'm the Director of Public Policy of an organization I co-founded called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're a grassroots think tank, unapologetically black in our advocacy in Baltimore in the public policy arena. And we were, been involved in a lot of issues, education included. One of the things that's relevant about my experience as it relates to this conversation, my background is actually in high school and collegiate policy debate. Policy debate as one of the activities within forensics is the most rigorous form of academic debate that exists. In the 80s and 90s, there was a movement around the United States led by college debate teams and nonprofit organizations to expose black debaters or black students and students in the inner cities to the activity of policy debate and all the benefits that come from participating in that activity. And so actually joined my debate team at Forest Park High School in Northwest Baltimore City. But I actually entered the activity during a moment where there's an intellectual and academic innovation in the activity of policy debate itself. And it started kind of around Dr. Eddie Warner and Darrell Birch at the University of Louisville, out of their Pan-African Studies department, challenging the norms and procedures of traditional debate, particularly the research methodology and the pedagogy in traditional debate was such that it perpetuated notions of racism and white supremacy, both in the outcomes and in the way that folks are oriented in general policy space. And so that culminated in a team of Liz Jones and Tanya Green in 2004 getting the quarterfinals of both national championship tournaments. And so my high school debate partner, because policy debate is a 2-on-2 activity, I'm also from Baltimore City. He actually went to the University of Louisville for 2 years, transferred back to Towson University in Baltimore to debate with me. And in 2008, we won a national championship, extending on the legacy of what Liz and Tanya did. Talking about, in that year, notions of the black aesthetic, the importance of understanding the ways in which images and narratives impact people's ability to engage policy and even how the mainstream engages policy. And a part of why that's important for me is because, so before 2008, there'd only been one, because again, policy debate is a 2-on-2 activity, there'd only been one black person to ever win a national championship. Since then, I think now there are 15 of us that have won national championships, and 6 of them are from Baltimore. And so what it really, to me, it's just, I'm really privileged to have been able to have been intellectually socialized in a maroon that has given me the tools to be able to, and that was the motivation for founding Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, is to take the public policy skills from the perspective that I learned it and be able to advocate for the interests of black people. Thank you.
Let me first say thank you for your service.
Thank you.
All right, come on.
All right. So my name is Kalisa Wing. What brought me to this work, I will have to say, are metal detectors and clear book bags is really what brought me to this work. So much like William, when I was growing up, my parents were married. We came from affluence. We were the only African-American family in the neighborhood. To that extent, although that sounds nice, but I remember being 6 years old and being told to go to the other side of the street or go back to Africa by adults in the neighborhood. I even had one adult in the neighborhood who would send his daughter that was about 6 years older than me outside every day to fight me because they didn't feel that we should be in the neighborhood. Once my parents got divorced, I moved from the affluent neighborhood to the inner city. And the first thing I noticed is that we didn't have any books, but we had metal detectors at every door. We didn't have teachers who were highly qualified, but we had full-time police officers every single day. And I felt very policed, even to the point when I lived in the inner city and I saw police on horses, I saw police on bikes, I saw police on foot. And now that I'm older and I hear some things, I'll never forget playing in the alley with a neon, playing cops and robbers, and the police coming up to us and telling us, I could kill you right now. And being 13 years old and hearing these things and feeling like my body was being policed at all times. But the thing that was different was that because I came from another neighborhood, I knew there were so many people who were systemically and systematically oppressed in the neighborhood that they didn't even understand what was being done to them. And so for me, being told by my 8th grade math teacher, the reason why I'm not teaching you guys anything is because you're gonna be dead or in jail. And so statistically, I shouldn't be here. I do have friends that are 6 feet under from the neighborhood, and I shouldn't be here, But here I am as the first person of color to be chosen as the Department of Defense Education Activity Teacher of the Year, and to sit in a room with the 2020 DODEA Teacher of the Year, who was the first black male educator to be recognized by our organization. And then I see our National Teacher of the Year, Rodney Robinson, is here, and we got to give that up because thank you, Virginia, Rodney Robinson. And so for me, the school to prison pipeline, because it was the life that society was trying to choose for me, But God said no, and a different narrative was created. And so for me, it's just very important that I educate as many people as I can on the school to prison pipeline, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Martin Luther King says. So this is what brings me to the work. Thank you.
All right. Let's snap it up for them on that alone. So you know they're going to bring it when this is going to be the best picture that comes out of this event. You got some good ones over here, but this is going to be the best one. All righty. So William, I always prefer to defer to people closest to the impact of policy when we're having these discussions. Why don't you talk a little bit about why it is so critical for student voice to be prioritized in conversations about education policies?
Wow. I don't even know where to start, because you would imagine that every decision ever made at the school level would start with students. And unfortunately, that's just not the reality. I think my ideal public education system would really have students at the core of every decision made, because students are the stakeholders. I think there's a saying that a wise man once said nothing at all. And I think our politicians and our school board leaders really need to sit down with students and say nothing at all and listen, because I think there's a lot of power, a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom that can come from sitting down and listening to kids that are in the classroom. There were administrators at my school that, until we made it a problem, didn't think that the school had a diversity problem. And I think sitting down and listening to students was something that was instrumental in making sure that came to light. So you can be, I always tell people, you can be very book smart and have a lot of degrees, but not really understand what's going on in the real world. And I think students have that knowledge. I think parents have that knowledge. I think community members have that knowledge, and they're all stakeholders at the end of the day. In a representative democracy, it's really the people that should have the power. Power is kind of defined, at least by most people, as having the ability to make someone do something that they wouldn't have otherwise done. And that power often comes from the top down instead of the bottom up, when in reality, those of us who are here today, those of us who are in the classroom, those of us who are invested in our children, as we should be, because children and students are the future, should really have that power. So that's typically how I think about the role of the student voice with regards to education policy.
And I would add to that, so I ran a school for 10 years, and what we would communicate to our young people, our school was a social justice school, what we communicated was that you are leaders right now and in the present. And so when you run a social justice school, you run the risk of having daily protests at your school. We had protests about the uniform, we had protests around what period they should be taking this course or that course. They rolled out of school one day and said, this is Indigenous Peoples Day. We are not celebrating that other holiday, and we're protesting in the middle of in the harbor. This was before you got there. When Trayvon Martin's life was taken so egregiously. They led a march right down the middle of downtown Baltimore. So it is critical that we see young people's voices as relevant and prevalent when we are doing policy making. And that doesn't mean supplementing their voices for wisdom, right? There's a place for young people, and there's a place for them to be involved in the conversation. Sometimes people go too far. And they say, young people figure it out. And then they step back under the guise of, this is student-led, as if these are not young people, which is nonsensical, because then you have them participating in a movement where they're destined to fail, as opposed to being responsive and interacting with their elders, which is critical in our community traditions. So I want to make sure we hear those things, and I deliver those things, because you were leading in that moment. Right, when you went to school and people were saying to you, this is not your place, and you said, I stand here in my place. That's leadership in the moment. So, I want to encourage folk to be really thoughtful about what student voice and student leadership can mean, but also what our role is in cultivating those voices, such that they're not forced to fail in ways that we already have failed without our guidance and wisdom, right?
Amen to that. And on that note, too,
Yep.
I'm glad you bring that up, and thank you. Because I think it's an incredibly important point, because, when we were organizing, we didn't do it in a vacuum. We were meeting with local leaders in South Carolina, whether it be our politicians or school board members or education, policy organizations, or even activists. As I believe I mentioned earlier, but I'll kind of expound upon it, one of our greatest resources was this Black Lives Matter organizer by the name of Mahiyadeen, and he was incredibly insightful and gave us so much wisdom and insight as to how to work with people and how to get things done. And I think as students, especially now in a day and age when students, especially kind of sparked by Parkland and those students rising up to positions of power and influence, students really have to be strategic in how we think about enacting change, because it certainly can't happen in a vacuum, and we have to do it with the wisdom of our elders, which I definitely acknowledge.
All right, great. So, Sister Zakia, you have traveled around the country doing some critical research around community-informed policymaking. Can you talk a little bit about some of the themes you've heard from around the country, what things kind of rose to the top?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of from the last panel really showed up for, as it pertains to young people in regards to like educators. They want to feel love. They want to see folks that actually look like them from their community. And so we went around, it was about 6 weeks, a project funded by the Hewlett Foundation, and we went to 10 cities. And I think for me, the most impactful one was the Camden visit, where it was young people ages 10 to 14. And the questions were pretty much like, what do you want to learn, know, and do before you graduate high school? And they were brilliant to the point of they could identify that there was racism happening, and that's why they didn't have a lot of the things they had. They could identify that it was a lack of funding that left them not having certain things. They talked about all the amazing things that they wanted. Like, I want to know how to write a check. I want to know how to, I want to travel. I want to learn how to be an entrepreneur, right? I want to buy a house. Like, how do you do that, And it was parents from Philly who, mostly Black women, right? They weren't all, but predominantly Black women were doing the organizing all around the country. And it was the same thing. And in Philly, what was very impactful for me was, at some point we broke up in groups, and everyone had to kind of identify what are the things that are important. What do you want your child to experience in the classroom? And it was like a sheet full of chart paper, right? Like each of them had, and so we went around and we debriefed, and things up there like love and respect. I want my child to feel, the person in front of them to feel like it's their child, like to be treated like it's their child. And there was a ton of stuff on it, and a parent said, oh my gosh, this is a lot of stuff. Is it too much? And I literally had to pause and say, is it what your child needs? Is it what our children need? Then it's not too much. And that was just another reminder about how we have a scarcity mindset, and we don't even believe that it's hard for us to digest that these are things that are tangible, that we could actually get, and not even get, but that our children deserve, right? And so you identify these things. Yes, we can. Yes, they deserve it. And because they were organizing groups, it was a plus, because now they had something to organize around. Like, they could continue their organizing in a really strategic way around these things. And the other thing I just wanted to acknowledge is that, our organization, AQ, is very fortunate to work with the youth, the Urban Youth Collaborative in New York City for more than 10 years now, the Alliance for Educational Justice, which is a national youth organizing group. And when we first started organizing with the Urban Youth Collaborative, we made a faux pas as adults of part of the parent organizing, which was, I try to tell them all the time when I speak to them, I think it was out of love, but we smothered, and we overtook the meeting, and we were like, that mentality, oh, your kids, we got this, we're gonna help you out. And it was a really powerful moment when they said, you know what, we don't know if we can work with y'all anymore. And it was a lesson learned for us. It was a lesson learned especially for me, and realizing that these are not your children. They're like your children. Like, I didn't birth them. Like, when you have kids, you're like, look, you can do that. But these are not your children, and they have an agenda. They have a fierceness. They have already decided what they wanted. And the goal, what I realized for us, was to support in any way we could. So we had relationships with elected officials. How do we open the doors for that? And so the Urban Youth Collaborative has led the mission around Solutions Not Suspensions bill that we're currently trying to get passed in the statewide level. And lastly, I'll just say, one thing I realized that the power in youth organizing is that we don't miss another generation. These young people, I've seen them grow up to be the organizers now of the youth group that they were a youth organizer with. They will be the next PTA presidents and secretaries. They will be the next board members. And so as we say that they're women and women of color are often the leaders, what I've seen is that young men of color, LGBTQIA young people, become the adults that allows us to like erase that generation that we lost, and their children will be the next ones to be like in diapers talking about power to the people.
Yes. So, do we want to pause here? No? Okay. So, Davon, you work with a Black think tank, one that is funded by the community, responsible to the community. Talk a little bit about whose voices are missing and what structures and barriers are in place that cause that to be so that we can think about how to break those down.
It's hard to overstate the extent to which this society is structured on racism and white supremacy. And it's really important to be grounded in that because every arena of civil society is impacted by this organizing principle of white supremacy. So in some of the ways that it shows up, the notion of Black inferiority is ubiquitous, right? Whether it's popular culture and the images and representations we see in popular culture, whether it's when we go to professional spaces and those in the professional jobs are whiter and those in the service and janitorial staffs are blacker and browner, whether it's even in our own formal education, where many of us have not been exposed to narratives of peoples of African descent operating in arenas marked as high levels of civilization, right? And so many of us, because of all of the images and all of the things we've been exposed to in this society, cannot imagine anything other than notions of Black inferiority. It becomes kind of the natural default that operates in the society. And that's important for two reasons. The first is that peoples of African descent have produced bodies of work to address many human problems. And one of those is questions of education. I've been hard-pressed to encounter education professionals, whether they're teachers, principals, administrators, researchers, policy advocates, for whom have studied the educational practices produced by Black educators prior to integration. And it's a travesty, because when you look at much of the works that have been produced, right? A few years ago, I was looking up Fannie Jackson Coppin, from which Coppin State is named after, right? And I came across a book that's out of print, but I found it online. It's a book where it's partially autobiographical, but then she literally, Fannie Jackson Coppin, at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, was an educational professional who ran the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia for 40 years. And she writes literally a manual for how to teach students, right? A book published in 1906, right? There are lots of texts like that where you have teachers and education professionals that have addressed many of these problems, but what has happened, the notion of Black inferiority and white supremacy has caused people to internalize this notion that if you want to address issues facing Black people, you have to be proximate to white folks, proximate to white-led institutions, and that solutions don't come from Black people, that Black people are the problem. And that leads to the second part as to why white supremacy and understanding that is so important, because then if you think about the profession of education as it has emerged from many of the other proximate disciplines, social work, public health, they've emerged in a milieu that understood, folks who are familiar with the Moynihan Report, for instance, right? It emerged during a context where notions of Black pathology was the framework that was used to develop programs to provide services to folks in our community. So if you have programs where the remnants of the little architecture of the methodologies used to provide services are rooted in this idea that Black folks are inherently criminal and broken and need to be fixed. And I would argue that the education profession as an industry over the past 50 years has failed at doing what it's been tasked with doing, right? So to Khalila's question, a part of what needs to happen is displacing the thought leadership of this industry. Now, that's a very threatening thing because there are lots of people that make a livelihood off of professing to be experts on education, who, as you know, Dr. Senalisa said on the last panel, can speak education needs but have no practical experience, expertise, or qualifications that has to do with being able to facilitate an educational process for young people. And one of the things that I take pride in is a part of why in my introduction I talked about debate. I've been able to see public school students become world-class scholars. And a big part of that has to do with the fact that there's a pedagogy that recognizes both their fundamental humanity, but also uses those intellectual resources that are often put to the margins, framed out of the mainstream. And there are people within our communities, I know in Baltimore, right? There are folks in Baltimore who are experts on facilitating quality educational experiences for young people that aren't in the mainstream, right? They will be, our methodologies in some contexts are considered old wives' tales or not as rigorous, or all those are code words for that black stuff, right? And so it's important that we begin to use it to understand that the folks that exist in our community that provide positive educational opportunities for our young people, some with the degrees, some not with degrees, understanding that without utilizing that talent and expertise that is resident in our communities, we will continue to allow the thought leadership in this industry to put forward educational professionals that will internalize notions of black pathology, see themselves as having to fix young people, and fail and continue to fail to do so.
Come on now.
I'm just going to pause for a moment. Come on now. Come on. In the true rich culture of the community, let the church say amen. Okay, come on through. If you go to a synagogue, if you go to a mosque, if you go to your living room on Sunday morning, that was a word. All righty. So I want to zero in on teachers, Kalisa. And how is it that teachers get involved in policy making? What is their place? Brother Curtis mentioned earlier that oftentimes teachers, and Brother Jose also said this, that teachers need to be developed and learn more about the theory and the practice and the 30,000-foot view around policy making so that they can be engaged. But what are some ways that you believe that teachers can be engaged, and why should they?
First I'll start with saying it is incredibly hard for teachers to acknowledge their expertise. I don't know what that is. They have, some of them experience imposter syndrome and don't think that they have a seat at the table. But show me another profession where every couple of years I have to be a lifelong learner. I have to keep up my certification. If I don't, I lose my licensure. I don't even think doctors have to do that. And but yet, probably one of the least paid professions that we have, and not, but that's a whole separate issue. Teachers, I believe, when they think about policy, it makes them, I think, a little bit afraid. I've always been one that just loves policy, wants to be near it, which led me into the career path that I'm on right now. But I think that too many times people who have access to policy are not providing that seat at the table for the teachers, not asking teachers any kinds of questions. And then I think one of the biggest mistakes that educators do make when they do get an opportunity to engage is not understanding who has what it is that you need and what kinds of questions that you need to ask. But also not understanding that, when we think about a discipline, the discipline guidance in your building, that's policy. When you think about the dress code, that's policy. All these, the student handbook, the faculty handbook, all of that stuff is policy. And I think when we think about policy, we're thinking way too big, and that it has to be this grandiose thing. But the policy is just simply, hey, principal, I saw the students walk into the cafeteria doing this, and maybe if we put this other thing in place, then we could fix that. So I think there's nothing that's too small when we're thinking about it. And if we come at it recognizing and realizing that we do have a place at the table, we do need to recognize our expertise, that I think if you've been doing something for 10 years, according to research, you have at least 30,000 hours of time in it, and you are an expert in the field. And we have to be comfortable and confident to say, I am an expert. It shouldn't take somebody becoming a teacher of the year for some policymaker to sit down and listen to you. I mean, that's ridiculous, because I know people in the buildings and that we interact with every day who have these amazing ideas, as he spoke about, but nobody's listening. And we have to also get out of the notion of, oftentimes I always hear, well, I'm just you are not just a nothing. You know, you are a mother, you are a father, you are a brother, you're a sister, you are an educator, and you have the ability to influence today's future and the future of tomorrow. I think one other thing that I think teachers need to understand is that they are leaders as well. So teacher leadership is one of the things that I'm so grateful that in my organization I've been able to adopt the teacher leader model standards, adopt the definition of teacher leadership, shift a teacher of the year program from just one of recognition and an attaboy, attagirl, to one where we're connecting leaders across the world, and we're empowering you, and we're teaching you about the change theory and how real change happens. And you need to make action plans, and you can make a difference, and you can just use what you got and do what you have, and start where you are. You don't have to, even if you don't have a squad, you can still just decide to start where you are at right now, using the resources that you have, and decide today, I am going to make a difference, even if it's just in room 134. So that's what teachers need to do.
Yes. So I want to encourage folk, if you have questions, to jot them down on your note cards. We're going to move into the Q&A section momentarily. So we'll have folk coming around who can take those note cards from you. So thank you. If you need a note card, perhaps raise your hand, or you can also use just a sheet of paper if you have one. So I just want to open this up to any of you to respond to what are some brass tacks things that we need to do to engage communities in policy making at the front end of policy. And for those of you, you're in DC, you're at a legislative conference, but I want to make clear that the research shows typically Black and Latinx communities have been engaging in policy making at the back end of policy making, the back end of the process, which would be protests, right? Something is coming down the pipeline, I don't like it, I'm protesting. Something is already in existence, I don't like it, I'm protesting. And often aren't engaged or cognizant of their right to go to a legislator and say, this is what I want. How do we write a bill about it? And how do we move it through the legislature? And so, what are some ways that we cultivate that knowledge where community members are clear, to your point, that they're not just in anything, that the schools belong to them, in fact? How do we do that?
I'll say one thing quickly. I believe firmly in the saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think kind of along with that comes the idea of, to your point, not everything can be achieved through a protest, although, protests and direct action have their value given the circumstance. But one thing that I think quite a bit about is, being 21 and looking for jobs and being on LinkedIn and, passing out business cards. We often leverage our network and our resources to benefit ourselves economically or with jobs. We can also leverage our resources to benefit our community politically. And I think that's one thing that I learned junior and senior year of high school, is that I was going to school with some pretty interesting people who had some parents or themselves with pretty cool connections that could help us achieve some of these things that we were trying to do. So I think for students, we can especially look to leverage our own backgrounds or our people in our community, whether it be so-and-so's dad who knows the mayor, or whether it be so-and-so's brother who's an organizer with Black Lives Matter. I think we can really look within to find that kind of network to make sure we can leverage our policies and get them at the scale that we want.
Great.
I would also say it's important to, as the sister said, to demystify the levers of power and how people get access to those that are making decisions. So literally, there are a handful of people for whom have certain relationships with legislators that are able to influence the nature of how policy is made. And a lot of times when you think about many of the traditional white-led nonprofit organizations that often stand in legislative spaces and speak for, quote unquote, the community on a level of policy, just to organize a handful of parents or community members to approach that organization and to say, if you continue to be a gatekeeper in the sense of representing our interests without us, then we're going to tell people about it. And a lot of these organizations that do that, their reputations are important to them. It's a part of how they raise their money. So if people are going around talking bad about how they exclude the community, that impacts their ability to write their grants and get the money that they're used to getting. So I think it's a part of is even really knowing our own power, right? And understanding that, literally just having something in your living room with some neighbors and inviting, those organizations over to say, this is what we want you to do. Here, we know that you may have certain expertise. This is what we want you to produce, and we want you to come back to us when you produced it.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, I didn't know, as I was sharing early on, I had no idea what policy was. I still struggle with it now and then, but I think the way we can relate to folks, like I had no idea as a non-college educated mother raising 8 children in the hood that I could even have any conversation around policy. And so how do we begin to relate that to even young people, to your point of when you're asking for something, a change in the lunchroom, your food, the chicken nuggets are soggy today and we don't want them anymore and we want something else, something healthier, right? That's part of changing policy in the school. And sometimes, and to your point, like it doesn't have to be large and huge, it could be that small. And often what we know is that when you get those small wins, those small victories, it lights a fire in you that, wow, I stood for something, I forced the issue, I organized with folks. While you might not be using the word organize, I got some folks together and we made change. I want to feel that again. And there's something about understanding that when parents and community members who are often not talked to, no one wants to have them at the table in their community, people look over them. The police in their community are not Officer Bob. They're like, they don't even acknowledge you and look at you. And that when you're in schools often, many times, like as a parent or even a young person, right, you're in there for a reason. Like, I'm not there to interact with you for fun, or you have a security guard at the front desk and he doesn't even look up. He's like, give me your ID. Like, so these places are not even welcoming to you. How do you even begin to start to think that, how can I change something in this space that I've had such a bad relationship with, right? And that's if you speak the language and you're from the country, right? So we're not even talking about, language barriers and all these other issues that pop up. So I think, to your point, I thought it was just really powerful about being able to explain to folks exactly what policy is and what it could look like and the possibilities, and knowing that once you get that victory, it is just something really exhilarating as a person of color, to know that you were able to get some level of justice. It is not freedom, it is not liberation, but it feels good. And that feeling you want to feel again.
So I'll just very quickly say, I know I'm big about dismantling the school to prison pipeline, but a very good friend of mine, Sharif El-Mekki, often talks about we need to be creating a school to activism pipeline. And I think if you're an educator and you're not engaging your students in design thinking and having them think about what are the things that are happening in the community around me and how can we get engaged and learn more about it, and then how can we impact change in the community to make it a better community for us, I think that is a very quick and easy win for an educator to start having their students see themselves as agents of change. If you are an educator in the room and you're wondering, how can I get involved in policy? One organization that I was able to work with and advocate for Title II funding was Teach Plus. So, and they're always looking for educators, so you can look them up. Organizations like Pearson are always looking for people that are going to talk about the reports that they talk about. Just like in 2030, our students are not gonna have the employability skills that they need, according to the research from Pearson. And we have to do a much better job at that. But I just think that policy is not a dirty word. I think, really, people need to understand that this is the only way that we are going to make the change that is going to be sustainable, that's going to stand the test of time, that's not requiring an individual or a person, but here, when you have the policy, you can really stand on that. And so I think when we think about what are the ways that we can get things done, we just have to start. I think just thinking on not such a big scale, but thinking about what are the small things that we can do in order to really bring the sustainable change that we need to our communities, and for our students to see themselves as agents of change, because we really do hold the power. We the people. You know, we are the people, and we can hold accountable the people who are supposed to be doing what they're supposed to do, and we know what we got to do if they don't.
Let's give them a round of applause. Do we have questions? Yep, come. Bring them up, and while they bring them up, I will, I know there's a fly harassing us. While they bring them forward, I just want to recap. So this is being filmed. I want to make sure nobody takes William's idea, because he's going to be developing an app to network to activism, and then LinkedIn might buy it for a couple stacks. Oh, Bill, okay. All right, so don't take his idea. Okay. And then we heard supporting people through small wins and helping them understand how the policy process is made. We heard calling the power brokers to come to you, tell them what you need, and require them to come back with you with those resources, that you have a right to do that. And then we heard collaborating with organizations that are that have access to the policymaking space and are looking to help elevate your voices as a tool for getting policies made. So I'm gonna just read these off quickly to make sure we stay on time. The first is, how do we displace that current thought leadership that Mr. Love mentioned? How do we reform the bureaucracy that is traditional teacher prep at institutions of higher education? And then we have, how do you as a community engagement partner ensure schools that by having students' voices be heard, students will be liberated rather than seen as a threat? And with National Voters Registration Week coming up as well, as a push to engage communities about the census, how do we engage the education communities to partner with coalitions? Take any. Go for it.
So I was a high school teacher for a couple of years. It was at a 6 through 12. But it also, you know, for every quarter they gave me like a section of middle school. And so I had a picture on my wall of being my debate partner with our trophy, and I didn't really say what it was. And so my students at one point said, "Mr. Love, who's that?" And I said, "Well, you know, that's me and my debate partner. When we were in college, we were some of the best debaters in the country." And they laughed and they said, "Mr. Love, why are you lying?" And I said, why do I gotta be lying? They said, "Because Mr. Love, if you all that, why are you here with us?" And to me, that just speaks to the extent to which, like, notions of black inferiority have seeped into the consciousness of our young people, of our adults, and people in the professional sector. And I would argue that's one of the biggest ways that those that are in that thought leader position are able to maintain their position. Because what they won't do, so if you think about like the 80s and 90s when there were big public fights about curriculum, about African-centered curriculum and multicultural curriculum, right? And you think about the battles that were had then. So we're in a moment now where culturally responsive pedagogy is now something that people are considering in mainstream spaces, right? It's a concession, right? Because they understood that the things that they were saying in the 80s and 90s to refute notions of African-centered education proved to be unsuccessful and ineffective, right? And so now what they do is they do two things. They may hire somebody that talks real black but has no power, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you should be mad at the person who has that position. It's just being clear about what their limitations are, right? The other thing they do is they avoid public confrontation, right? They avoid having public conversations about the kinds of things that they support as an institution. And so one of the things that I've been more clear about over the past couple of years is being really clear about lanes, right? If you're a service provider, so a teacher, social worker, if your job is to provide services to your constituency, the people that you're tasked with serving, what needs to happen is a clear lane of those that are advocates that can engage the policymaking space and use the policymaking space as an arena to challenge the thought leadership of the sector. So in Baltimore, one of the things that I'm working on is the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. There was a task force that decided that race equity, capacity building, and technical assistance was a core part of what needed to happen to challenge racism in the sector. That was something that the task force explicitly said. And what's interesting is we're getting a lot of pushback, right, from the corporate sector who enable the people who are the thought leaders, in the education and youth serving space. But it's never a public conversation, right? There are people who I know who are on the task force. So there's a guy named Bob Embry who runs the ABLE Foundation in Baltimore City. I know for a fact that he disagrees with the approach, right? But he was on the task force and voted for it, right? Because he understands that a public conversation, he can't win that. So a part of what we do is use the policymaking space and target individual people who are those gatekeepers, right? Making sure that you have the cover to do so, right? Making sure you have diverse revenue streams so that when people attack you, it doesn't, impact your ability to feed yourself, right? And that's a lane, again, for those who are in that advocacy space, right? And it's important for people not to try to straddle both because, it's just a lot of work for one person. So I think it's really important to cultivate that advocacy side that can say the things that maybe you can't say, right? Maybe it doesn't make sense for you to say it as the teacher in the school, but it's important for us who are on the political side to get that information so that we can make examples of the people that are those thought leaders.
And I think to your point, and I truly believe in self-efficacy. So I think if you are at a table and you know that you are not the best person to be at the table, I think you should give up your seat and let the people know, you know what, William is the best person to speak for this. We need to be hearing from him. So I think to whom much is given, much is required. And when you have some privilege, I do think that you need to leverage that privilege and your sphere of influence to bring other people into it as well. So how do we shift that? The people who do have the power need to bring some other people in. And Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't have a seat at the table for you, you bring your own chair.
So, I just want to piggyback on what you just said, because the fact of the matter is, even some of us in this room hold spaces where we are privileged and block out others who should have our seats, right? So this is not a race issue, right? Sometimes we serve as the gatekeeper, the good black, if you will, who will not push against the system, who might say social justice-y things, but in practicality, when we're behind the scenes, we don't push, or we're actually not invited to the behind-the-scenes conversations. And so we need to be conscious of also how all of us, right, if you have a college degree or if you've been in justice spaces and are now the golden child that's always invited. How do you bring people in? How do you give up your seat? You can make a way to make sure that you're invited back to the table if you're adding value. But you have to be willing to step aside and let the directly impacted voice speak for themselves, right? So you don't become the negative gatekeeper. So I just want to make a quick point about the voter registration point and census point. I think we can use social media and other spaces to really lift up National Voter Registration Day. I think we've heard things. I also live in Baltimore City. We have our city council president who put forth a policy agenda that said 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote in municipal elections, and lots of people were poo-pooing that. Whereas down the road in Montgomery County, 16-year-olds can vote in municipal elections, right, when there are issues on the ballot related to their locality. So whatever we can do to engage young people on the front end authentically in the process, I think that's critical. So there are lots of resources out there. One is, I think, When We All Vote, the First Ladies Initiative, that can help give resources for teachers to understand how they can better prepare classrooms. I also want to say that beyond voter registration, schools can use a lot of support on civics education. Let's not leave it up to the government teacher to do that, because oftentimes they're trying to get kids to a test they can pass. But civics education is critical, and bringing in elected officials to hold court with those children so they understand their voice is critical. Let's give this panel a round of applause, a shout. You can run around the church if you need to. Whatever seems right for you. Let's hear it, let's hear it, let's hear it. Give yourselves a round of applause. So we are going to see if there are other questions, because we are going to make sure we allow some folk to get here who are en route from the Hill. Are there any other pieces of information that you all want to give to the room?
I think somebody, you mentioned, or somebody, it might have been the last panel, and it made me think about something that we talk about in education, and we talk about achievement gaps, but I believe that we have a belief gap. And I think the reason why people don't go into policy is because you have a belief gap. You have a belief gap in what you believe that you can do, because somebody told you that you didn't have the voice that you do have. And so I think that if we just increase the belief in ourselves, the belief in our ability to change, to be the change and to make the change, I think that hopefully we'll see more people getting into policy. I hope that we will see more educators believing in their students and their abilities, and so that our students can then become the future of believing and continuing that belief, so that we close achievement gaps and increase belief.
Yeah, if I could just co-sign, I appreciate that, around belief. As in New York right now, we have a chancellor who is centered in equity. Like, he's a Mexican American, and he talks about his heritage. And he came in, and New York City wasn't ready. They was having a conversation around integration, but they wasn't ready. They were not ready, right? And so he's leaning forth with an equity agenda. The College for Educational Justice, which is a parent-led group, is pushing for culturally responsive education. Black, brown immigrant parents from across the city got $23 million investment from the mayor to start implicit bias and anti-racist training for educators, which are currently going on as we speak now. The chancellor was all about it. He was like, yes, let's do this for all educators. We're going to make this happen, right? Changing the curriculum is part of the conversation that's happening now. And he had it started before he got there, but there was a advisory committee that was started. I would say 60 folks, like some powerhouses of folks. Young people were on it, parents sit on the group. They came out with some recommendations. School Diversity Advisory Group was what it was called. And the recent one came out last week, which was to get rid of the gifted and talented programs, which 4% of children attend. Let's be clear, 4%, right? You would have thought, he said the recommendations was like just to get rid of all schools that had white kids in it. Let me tell you, they came like the thunder for equity. They were like, no, you can't get rid of this. And the belief, where I got to the belief, is that we, as folks of color, we were the first ones jumping on the front saying, no, we need to expand it. His agenda is not to get rid of it just to get rid of it. It's because his belief is that every child is a gifted child. But we have even co-opted that narrative that no, not all our children are gifted and talented, right? We have brought into that narrative of hierarchy that we want to say our children got into this. They tested and they got into this program, right? We would rather believe that than, one, acknowledge that the reason, which I've heard from some parents, which makes sense, the gifted and talent program in this school is where my child gets access to a science lab, to books, to trips, to art and music, and you need to be saying that that's not okay. That's the only way children have access, is to get into a gifted and talented program, as if every child doesn't deserve to have access to art, music, and all those other things. Now that's the conversation that no one wants to have, because it's almost like you have to give up something, that level of power, that level of privilege. It may not be right now, but at the end of the day, if you can't say, I want this, and how are we going to get there, and you're just saying, as long as my child has this, I'm good, that's a problem, right? Because we don't even believe in ourselves that every child deserves to be in a school like that. And as long as we're in that mindset and that's how we think, then white supremacy and everything else will just, it is a breathing dragon. Because we don't need white folks to come at us, because we coming at our own selves. Right? And so when we see what happens when people come with equity, when you have leadership that comes and says, we want to level the playing field, we want to raise equity, we want to get rid of these programs that are steeped in racism and keep kids out. They keep the very kids that you claim that you want to integrate with. Right? And so as long as we continue to do that, we see that happening right now. It is ugly about what's happening when we have a chancellor that's for equity and the community that claims to say they want to be integrated and they want to desegregate and they want this, that, and the other, and they want to make sure black and brown kids are doing well. Let me tell you, it doesn't look that way.
One additional thing I'll say is that caring is a tremendously important thing as it relates to like caring about children and caring about young people. But I also want to say that it's not enough. Because when you think about like how you would treat any other profession, you know, if someone was doing surgery on you, right, you would want to make sure that person is really clear about what they're going to do. As it relates to questions of racial equity, you know, we see racial equity, cultural responsive pedagogy become a buzzword where lots of people deem themselves qualified because they read a handful of books and they really zealous about it. And so I think it's really important that we demand a level of rigor when we talk about issues of cultural responsive pedagogy, race equity, a level of rigor so that we don't, because a part of what will happen is that there's a lot of opportunism afoot, right, where the suffering of black people has always been fertile ground for exploitation, right, to use to absorb notions of racial equity into the mainstream, into those institutions, and therefore create an environment where the very thing that we fought for became neutralized because of the way that it got absorbed into the institution. So I think it's important that we demand rigor of those that are professing to practice race equity and cultural responsive pedagogy.
Yes, yes. Go ahead. Hey, sis. How are you? All right.
I see, first of all, a hope that Mr. Rodney Robinson from Virginia is the National Teacher of the Year and represent. Can you stand up, Rodney? Who teaches in a school system where, unfortunately, those kids have been cast aside, forgotten about, given not the best educators, and Rodney's belief in those students turns them around. And then we can amplify those stories of those students who people have forgotten about or cast aside. I think that's very hopeful. There's a lot of things that we can be proud of. The fact that Johanna Hayes, a former educator, is the first black woman to be, serving her district. I think there's a lot of great things that we can definitely celebrate. We have to learn how to celebrate all of the successes, whether they be big or small. But I do also want to caution us at the same time. Often I tell a story about there was a town who had a 99% success rate in the fires. And everybody was so excited, and they were out there in the media, and they saw this one family off to the side, and they were very upset looking, and they went over to them and said, "What's wrong with you? Like, everybody's happy, 99% success rate." And then they said, "Well, our house is the house that burned down." So, I do want us to celebrate all the successes, but I also want us to be realistic about what is really happening. And we talk about like the policies and all these things and why teachers are afraid. I have a woke ed chat that we run, and I had teachers come in from El Paso saying, "I don't know what to tell my students." And we gotta be real about this. When we have people trying to cross over and come in, and we got Bahamians right now trying to get here and get aid and get relief. And this is what the reality is that is happening. It's not all pretty. There are some wonderful things to celebrate. We are proud to be sitting here 400 years later, but I'm disappointed that we are still not realizing and actualizing our true equality and equity that we deserve because we built this country, my ancestors and everybody. So I am very proud of a lot, but I do feel like we have a long way to go.
So I want to just add, because we do need to wrap up now. We've gotten the hook. I want to make another plug for our work at the Center for American Progress and ask the room to hold us accountable. We are pushing into a space that we hadn't necessarily been before in this manner. And that includes making sure that we are moving around the country, that we are going from place to place to place, asking people what their preferences are, what policies they would like to see. So that's a place where I see hope as we set an example for other think tanks that are not run by the community in the way Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is, but that we have an opportunity to really speed up the progress for our students and kind of cast aside this concept of incremental change that I think we've been stuck in more progressive spaces, and recognize we don't have time for increments, that we need to move more rapidly. So let's again give the panel a round of applause. I'm going to turn over the mic to Bayless Fitterman, who's going to introduce Representative Ayanna Pressley from the good state of Massachusetts.